everybody. Welcome to yet another episode of the Soldiers of Cinema podcast. We're at episode 27. This is the second in a two-parter. Last week we covered Little Dieter Needs to Fly, and this week we're going to be covering Herzog's Rescue Dawn. As always, with me today to discuss this film is Mr. Cullen McFader.
Hello, welcome back to the Dieter Dengler duo.
Nice.
Two-parter.
I know you've been working on that for days, and
it's a tongue twister,
and it paid off. You know that hours of practice. It's like, I remember as an actor, we'd do all these like vocal exercises. You'd be, it's like
brown cow.
I mean, if you ever want to see something funny, go into the dressing room like an hour before like the opening of a play in like a little community theater and watch actors. But that kind of
paint the wall with your voice.
But yeah. Anyway, fantastic, man. Well, it's great to be here once again, and I'm excited to be covering this second film covering the same subject matter, in effect. I think it's the only time Herzog's ever done this. I mean, he certainly has common narrative themes, common locations, and we're going to talk about that a little bit here. But to cover the exact same subject in two films, one a documentary and one a narrative, I don't think Herzog's ever done before.
And what's interesting is we speculated last week on our previous episode about why did Herzog do the documentary first?
Was it in the plan?
And then came up with the movie later, but no, it was in the plan to do the narrative all along, and then he did the documentary as kind of an interim. While he was trying to get funding for the narrative. So
that's
interesting
what it seems. Yeah.
We seem to sort of be partially correct on that assumption.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know exactly, did Herzog create that short film with the specific intent to get funding? I don't think that's the case, because as I understand, but I think yes, when he was started to get into that documentary, I'm sure he had the idea, this would actually make a great narrative film. But as I understand it, he was actually asked by German television, and I don't know exactly which channel or entity, but he was asked by German television to create a couple episodes for a show, I think of Voyages into Hell, basically what the show was titled. I've never seen it or heard of it, so I don't know a ton about it. But they actually came to him and asked him if he would produce some or direct some content for them. And I think initially they wanted him to discuss the on-set challenges and wackiness of Fitzcarraldo. And he said in like a super Herzogian way, I don't want to circle my navel. You could do that in the Herzog accent. I'm never going to try to do that from you. So that's like always going to be your thing if you want to do that in his accent. But he didn't want to circle his navel, as he put it, which I thought is a hysterical way to kind of say, look, to make something about my own work is kind of ridiculous. Although, of course, he does that a lot in other instances. But he's like, hey, but I've got another idea. I read this magazine article about this guy, Dieter Dengler, and I think that actually would make a really cool topic for the show. So that is what led him to meet Dieter and do Little Dieter Needs to Fly. And then I think from there, he was like, this is so intriguing. I think, and you and I have talked about this, he felt such a kinship to Dieter. I think this grew out of that. Yeah. And
definitely, I mean, just on the basis of, they're very similar in their, one of the things that I mentioned while we were having our conversation was that, it's like their intuitiveness is very similar. Their instinct is very similar. Neither of them hesitate. They're both very no nonsense. They're both very, as you put it, kind of this very masculine, in a very traditional sense, not in the sort of sense of like, big muscle man on the beach, but rather this very, that traditional sense of like kind of older, I guess, masculinity that Herzog seems to put into a lot of his movies. So I can see why they would get, totally. And I can see why they would get along so well. Even just the fact that they've both got these very foundational relationships with the jungle. Of course, Herzog having made, I think you said this was his 7th film that he made in the jungle. Right. And then, of course, Dengler having spent, half a year, if not more, including the time traveled, spending that in the jungles of Laos and in the Vietnam War. So I think it's very interesting that these two, it's as though you took the filmmaker out of Herzog and put a pilot, a military pilot into that role, and it would be perhaps Herzog in that instance would be a very similar person to
it's
Dieter,
possible.
even more so.
Yeah, it's fun to think about. I mean, they're definitely, I think, you see a lot of similarities, and some of them between Dieter and between Herzog, and I think you can see, a lot of what probably drew Herzog to Dieter. I mean, first and foremost, I mean, they're both German.
Yeah.
And
both
I
grew
think
up during the war. Yeah.
Both grew up during the war. We talked about this, some of these similarities when we were discussing Little Dieter Needs to Fly. But I mean, I think there's some surface level stuff. But there's also, I mean, I get a sense, just from what we know about Herzog and what little we know about Dieter, that I can certainly see why Herzog would that they would both see each other as kind of kindred spirits.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, that, like, I just want to maybe kind of bounce some ideas back and forth here briefly, kind of about this idea of Herzog being a masculine director. And I don't, and I don't even know, like, we kind of can brainstorm this here live on the podcast, because I've thought about this kind of in passing before, but I haven't really hashed out a full-fledged, detailed kind of thought on this or analysis on this, if you will. But I mean, I feel like it's such a part of his mythos and such a part of his his public persona, and it's also a big part of the films that he's made. And in previous films that we've watched, I think in doing some research for some of the other podcast episodes we've covered, he talks about not having many female lead characters, and because he draws so much kind of from his own experience, and I think his viewpoint is often quite male and quite masculine, and and that's interesting to me. And I think his mythos is like this. It's like he does an interview and he gets shot in the thigh, and he's like, oh, it's but a scratch.
Well, he's like a no-nonsense, like giant silent colossus.
Kind
that
of
makes sense, right?
It does. But I mean, he's got that. It's like he talks regularly about an attitude of complaint. I don't I don't want anywhere on my set any kind of attitude of complaining. Suck it up. And you had kind of said silent acceptance was a good phrase to kind of describe his mentality, and it seems to be right. I mean, Herzog is a very physical actor. He's very much a risk-taking actor. Even I mean, director. Even though he would say that he isn't. I mean, he certainly is not afraid of being extremely physical on location in jungles amongst dangerous insects and animals, and forging white rapids, and all these kind of things, which are such kind of traditionally masculine.
Which is very similar to what you said, and very literal in terms of the context of this movie as well, that, this movie was made for $10 million, which isn't really a lot of money, especially when you consider that it was shot in Thailand, on location, in terms of, they were in a
with
jungle.
Hollywood
actors.
It
wasn't a soundstage. It wasn't, an hour outside of LA.
Yeah.
With Hollywood actors. And so that really, I think, puts it into almost a nice little box of what type of filmmaker Herzog is, that even when he does have, I think this is a large, in terms of the movies that he's made, $10 million is definitely on the larger end of his budget. But that's by no means for, you look at the budgets of something like Apocalypse Now, which of course shot on location. You look at the budgets of even something like Platoon, or most like large war movies, or even movies that just aren't necessarily large scale war movies, but rather just movies that shoot on location like this. And their budgets balloon and they skyrocket, whereas Herzog kind of had to figure out how to do this for not a lot of money. And I think that very much is part of it, is this no nonsense, no complaint. And it's not, and again, kind of one of the ways that I described it was that it's not like he, at least, I don't know Herzog, but the way I see it is he's not the type of person that if an actor were to complain, he would get mad at them or he would scold them or anything like that. It would more be like this, again, this silent sort of, all right, he can complain, but that doesn't change anything.
Yeah, and I want to be clear too. I just want to kind of clarify, that when I'm using the word that I kind of feel like he's a masculine director. I mean, it's not because I feel like the things that are associated with femininity are complaining or or not being able to be physical on set or anything like that. That's absolutely not what I'm meaning, and I really am using masculine in a very traditional,
exactly,
and including like unflattering ways, right? I mean, like kind of a socially kind of an older.
Don't talk about your emotions. Don't.
Yes, that's what I'm talking about.
And I think that's kind of why I also tried to specify that it's this very old style of masculinity.
Yes,
like this almost like John Wayne-y kind
Correct.
of masculinity.
That's
not to, as you said, diminish femininity, but
or
rather
a woman's
just that
capability
there's
to make
this
films
very
or anything.
much,
Yeah.
just from a very analytical standpoint, to say that Herzog is a he exudes this masculinity, that type of masculinity in his films, is very, it's an accurate
I think so.
statement.
I think it's an appropriate way to analyze. And again, I'm looking at his subject matter. I'm looking at the characters that he's telling stories for. They're almost always men. You know, the major characters in his film are almost always men, and they're he has a very strong masculine perspective in his opinion and in the way he tells stories and in the people who he chooses as characters to tell these stories through. So that's certainly what I'm referencing.
Well, and this isn't of course this isn't Rescue Dawn, but you look at just the history of his filmmaking, and it's like you look at when we discussed this a little bit when we were doing Nosferatu, which is that the moment that Nosferatu starts to share his emotions and starts to get emotional, he dies. He's killed by them, right? So there's definitely this, not that I think that Herzog would call someone a sissy for getting emotional, but rather I think that it is very much, especially in this movie, an analysis of people who are in control of their emotions, people who are, for lack of a better term, clear thinking, very very intuitive
rational.
And very rational and stuff like that, and it kind of comes back and forth between this this battle of the minds, I guess you could say, between Jean and Dieter in the movie, which of course we'll get into later about the historical accuracy of that, but in terms of the narrative of the film, there's very much this kind of yin and yang of Dieter being the person who comes in and is like, we're going to get out of here, we're going to escape. July 4th is the day we're doing it, no later. And I said earlier, too, that this is, to me, that is almost like an possibly unintentional metaphor for Herzog's filmmaking style, in that he is very much no hesitation.
Yeah.
Where
urgency.
Like, there's no urgency, exactly.
Well, I think that this film actually opened theatrically on the 4th of July. Which is just, I don't know if that's coincidental or, if this is kind of by design.
Because perhaps he thought himself too at the time. It's like, we're opening on the 4th of July. So that's
come hell or high water, we're doing this.
That's what there's definitely points where that can be taken to the extreme and be taken too far. But I think that, to me, that's such a great, valuable lesson just in terms of filmmaking. And of course, this is a filmmaking podcast. So just to even talk about that for a second, of just like, yeah, I think that it goes right along with his masterclass when you think about that. His whole point is like, don't delay, don't, have urgency, write your script and get out there, and don't, dilly-dally about the finer details of the screenplay, things like that, which I totally
don't overanalyze.
In fact, it's something that I'm, without getting into detail, I'm going through right now, where I'm like, okay, I'm making a feature. This is the deadline.
Yeah.
And it happened, even in 2019 when I came down, we did our documentary in California, where my thought was, okay, on this date I'm buying a plane ticket, whether or not we have a story done.
We're just doing it.
I'm flying down, and it went great. I mean, it was one of those things. It was the proof is in the pudding, where I came down and we made it.
You were actually the only person out of our group that actually did. You pulled the trigger.
I was like, got to get some skin in the game.
There you go. But so these are, so we're kind of, to put this in context again, I mean, these are things I think that Dieter and Herzog seem to share.
Yes, exactly.
Not only do they share these kind of childhood similarities of where they grew up, the conditions that they grew up under, but this, I think, you see a lot of similarities in perspective, it seems like, attitude and personality. Of course, we can only speculate, but that's what we're here to do, is to speculate. So, and I think too, there is, again, speculation, my hunch, but I think there's like an honor to Dieter as this, clearly kind of idealized character. I mean, he's a human being, just like any of us are human beings, but this kind of story is, I think, is crystallized as a part of the human condition that's important to Herzog, which is a type of honor, which is to survive existence, if you will, right? That life is suffering, and to, like you kind of said, to accept that and to continue to move forward in life and to be productive and to still live in spite of, and I think this is what Herzog, I think, is drawn to the jungle for so many. Like we said, this is, up until now, this was his 7th film being shot in the jungle. I mean, it's insane. As I think maybe it represents that it's like when, walking through life is like walking through the vines and the prickly thorns and the swamp and the mud and the leeches. of life, that life is always suffering. I know we're going to get really like we'll get really positive and optimistic here, but I think you guys know what I mean. I mean, it's, yes, life is wonderful, but yes, it's always suffering. And when you try to accomplish a task, whether it's make a film or anything else in life that has, if the goal has any kind of value and is worthwhile, it's going to be, has any challenge to it. This is what the world is. It's
if at the moment of challenge you give up, then you're never going to get out of that POW camp, is essentially the point.
It's like leeches sucking from you. It's vines growing up around your legs and threatening to throttle you.
The whole world is leeches sucking from you and vines crawling up your leg. There you go.
Oh my God, I love it. I just love it. But I mean, we've all felt like that, right? It's like, I mean, how many times have you been, in the thick of it, and surrounded by the fog of war, you're on a shoot, or you're trying to do something, you're trying to get a project funded, I don't know, whatever it is. I mean, heck, trying to build an addition onto my house, or life is just, every single day life is filled with many of these things, trying to reach customer service for 90% of the companies you do business with. I mean, everything. And you're just like, the whole world is just conspiring against you to just, suck the very essence from your bones. And I can completely see how the jungle is such a great analogy for that.
So everything out there wants to kill you.
Everything out there wants to kill you.
And that's, but I think that it's not even like a, pessimistic look at life. I think if anything, it's pragmatic. It's a very pragmatic and, there's an air of positivity, because in all these instances,
for sure,
they get out, they win. Herzog's he's never succumbed to the jungle.
And that's what I feel like. If I could kind of crystallize what I feel like, I'm guessing, again, speculation, not speaking for Herzog, but that would be my guess. I mean, that's what I see, and that's what speaks to me from these films when I see them. It's about the endearing nature of the human spirit. And I wouldn't even say, I would go further and say it's not that everything wants to kill you. It's that everything doesn't give a crap about you. That's actually what it is. It's the complete and total indifference of the universe as to your life, your wishes, your dreams, your pain, your suffering, your agony, whatever it is. It's total indifference. The universe doesn't care. Everything's just fighting for its own life. And
again, it's where you get through these exactly, like, it's and again, to avoid going off on a tangent about all of his movies, but you again get this through line through all of, like, that's very much, to make this point, what I think Herzog and Dieter really connect on is that through Herzog's movies, he's always said this. In Grizzly Man, he talks about how it's like that Timothy Treadwell had this romanticized vision of nature and the universe, and that when he saw the bear cub dead, it killed him. Whereas Herzog is like, that's life. That's but it doesn't mean that you can't persevere beyond that. But that is
even more,
I think, to me, what Herzog's message is and what his point is through all.
I mean, I think even more than just persevere. I mean, I think that you can actually partake joyfully in the sorrows of the world. I think that, I mean, look at, Herzog's made a life of this. It's not that just he's persevering through challenging shoots. It's where he actually finds his life's treasure, is in these most difficult, challenging situations. And look at the art that he's brought the world and what beauty that is. And I'm sure that that's filled his life with profound purpose. And I mean, it's what he lives for. It's clearly what he lives for. He's one of the most prolific directors of his generation. And I don't know how old he is now. What is he, 80? Almost 80? Something?
70, late 70s.
Late 70s, and he still makes, about a film a year?
Yeah.
So, clearly he's still in there, and he's still doing it. And it's inspiring to me, especially as an older dude. I'm a late bloomer. It's inspiring to me.
I mean, it gives, for me, who, I'm just in my early 20s now, it definitely is it's a good sign that, you don't have to...
You don't have to give up young.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you don't have to sit down and take that office job just because it's easy and it pays well.
I think that's what I get out of this film. That's what I get out of so many of Herzog's films.
Yeah.
It's the narrative thread that I kind of see through so much of his work. And really, I would say it's probably one of the most endearing and inspiring aspects of not just Herzog's work, but kind of at least the persona that he presents to the world. Is just a big part of why he's an inspiration to me. And so so let's talk about it's a little segue here. So, one of the challenges is the challenging of getting challenge of getting a film made. I mean, and even for Herzog, you mentioned that this film was a budget of 10 million, and that was actually like a fairly decent budget for Herzog, which is, it's so interesting to me that, you can be as successful and legendary a director as Herzog, and still finding $10 million can take you that long.
Yeah.
It's challenging, but...
And it's an interesting story in this situation, too.
It
how
is
he got
interesting.
That money.
So apparently, a little bit of background here. This film was entirely funded privately. Actually, believe it or not, by a basketball an NBA player who actually had a film company. As Elton Brand is the name of the player. Yeah. Yep, and he was a founding member and president of Gibraltar Films, and they actually funded this film almost entirely, which I find pretty fascinating. It wasn't until later that MGM came in and became the distributor of the film. But and I think something that I want to talk to you a little bit about here is, looking at this film and how it was shot and its production design through that lens of having such a tiny budget, because I really feel like Herzog does an extraordinary job, as he has done with a lot of films. You look at the scope of films like a Gary. I mean, it's like some really epic looking films. I mean, and with such little budget. I think this is a great example of that too. I mean, I'm aware. So when I watched the film, I'm curious if you were, and I've seen it a few times. I don't think the first time I saw it, I was aware of this at all. But I'm aware of the compromises that I can see that they had to make because of budget. I mean, you can see that, we're not showing a lot of, of scale in the beginning.
Especially in the aircraft carrier.
Especially on the aircraft carrier. I mean, we're shooting very tight. It's like very clear that, we don't have a whole plane. We just have a kind of a cockpit mock-up. I mean, there's some things like this. It's interesting to note, too, by the way, that this was the first time Herzog had ever used CGI. So we got the CGI sequence of the Sky Raider planes in the beginning, because there are no more, apparently.
Which really is only, like, enough. I would say, probably a minute of screen time at most.
It's very short, yeah. And not only that, but the crash, the actual, when the plane hits the ground, is practical.
That's all practical. Yeah,
it is a practical. But, I mean, and you can see even in that, I mean, even in that explosion, or the crash, rather, it's very tightly shot. We don't have a lot of wide, establishing shots to give it scope. But Herzog still does an extraordinary job with that. And I think, where they shoot it. I mean, I think the fact that they were willing to take a small group and go out and actually live in the jungle for 44 shoot days. I mean, it's amazing that the production value that you can see so much of that on screen. It's really extraordinary. But I mean, I think it's a really good example of what you can do with not a lot of dough.
Totally.
And with Hollywood, actors, we've gotten, I'm sure these, especially Christian Bale probably took a cut here. I hadn't read anything specific about what his fees were, but to be able to shoot with, Hollywood actors, $10 million, 44 shoot days on location in Thailand is amazing.
And I mean, I mentioned this too, where it's like there's a moment where you pull back and show the whole set of the POW camp. The prison, and it's incredible. It looks, I was sitting there thinking, like, it looks really, I think Herzog did a really wonderful job of really stretching that $10 million.
Yeah.
And making it, putting it to really good use.
Well, it apparently one of the ways they did that there was that the prison camp, the POW camp, was actually the only set that they built. That they actually used pre-existing real villages for all the other locations. And you can, and it really comes across because you can clearly see their age.
That they're lived in and stuff like that. Yeah.
The jungle has kind of, because they've been there for so long, these villages, the jungle has crept in and just, they're half consumed by the jungle. So that's of course something that would be extremely difficult and expensive to do if you had to build it yourself and then, wait for the jungle to encroach again. But production design was outstanding. Of course, Herzog is so, I think, he has so much experience shooting in these areas, shooting on location, working with local crew. And that's another way that, I think clearly you save a ton of dough. And his experience with that is sure paid off. I mean, it's interesting. All the extras were local here in this entire film, and all of the actors who played the Viet Cong are all actually stuntmen. Yeah. Which it was interesting to learn. They're actually experienced stuntmen, and even and apparently one of the main guards with the longer hair and the sunglasses actually worked as a stuntman with Christian Bale in the Batman film.
Yeah, because Batman Begins would have just been a year before this.
Just a year before this, yeah. So
which probably was even less considering. Well, I guess Batman Begins was probably shot in 2005. This was probably shot 2006-ish.
So, yeah. So, but it really is amazing, and it was a treat. It was a treat for me. I don't know how you feel. Curious to know, but it was a treat for me to see that Herzog had actually used CGI, and he admits to storyboarding.
CGI well, and then again, that was another thing is that it makes sense. I mean, again, you kind of have to when it comes to effects like that.
You have to.
There's a few things in here too, because I pointed out also that there's 2 or 3 shots in the movie that use zoom lenses as well.
Right.
So there's a few of those things that Herzog says that he rarely, if ever, uses that.
Which we've noted before. Yeah, which we've noted
that he's
before.
used. Yeah, he's certainly used zooms before.
Yeah.
I think that's really it. I think it's. His use of CGI here is very restrained. It's certainly only, I think, in the moments where, like, I think that for the flying sequence, of course, there's the moment where you get the pan over and you see the plane take off, and that's very, it's clearly CGI because there's not a huge budget for those effects. And he
even uses stock footage for the
the
landing,
documentary,
right? He uses stock footage before that, so he's really limiting
the use of CGI,
the use of CGI to the bare minimum. I feel,
and then you look at, but even the moments when they're in the sky, when they're flying in the Sky Raiders, and you can tell that the cockpit is real and that they probably shot it outside on some sort of very, very, minimal motion control thing. It's probably just even like a manual thing that they could shake with their hands or something.
If even, it might have been camera shake, Yeah,
exactly, yeah. But it almost like, to me, it felt those flying sequences, as short as they are, they felt very, in a good way, very childlike. Like it felt to me like reminded me sort of like the movies that I used to make in a weird way, with like Lego people sitting in cockpits. Yeah. And I don't know if that was intentional, but what it made me feel like was that this was almost Dieter's impression of what being a pilot was like when he was a kid. That it's almost like you're bringing this, because it felt very, just seeing him sit in the cockpit and talk, and it was like, I don't know, it felt very playful, not in a fun
innocent,
way,
innocent.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, and not in a bad way. Well, that
and
is
it also
actually
describes, it goes along with what Dieter said too about how he didn't know there were people down there, like that he didn't ever consider that there were people on the ground when he was dropping bombs, that he was just up there because he loved flying.
Well, that's a really interesting observation, and I like that. And now that you say it, I look back and I think, I know because of the commentary on the Blu-ray of this film, Herzog, it was definitely conscientious of and wanted to impart, and there's deleted scenes which actually build up to this even more, that Dieter was really innocent and naive about what he was actually going to do. That, to him, this was an adventure. He just loved to fly. Like, he just wanted a chance to fly. That's why he was there. And I think, that kind of innocence really permeates the whole character of Dieter. I think through the whole thing, whether it's like, the smiling guard moment where he kind of shares this little moment with the guard, his ability to keep his attitude positive and optimistic. Even when they're in the jungle and
Dwayne is saying, "Oh, I'm not going to make it." He's like, "No, come on, we'll go get milkshakes and burgers."
Well, with everyone, right? I mean, all the other characters, Dieter, and so you're right. I feel like there was this effort, and even extending through to the effects, which you just mentioned, that there is this childlike kind of quality, and that's really endearing. That's really endearing.
No, I loved it.
I can totally see that.
Yeah. And even just the fact that you never, like, there's no, sweeping shots of all the planes coming in. It's very much close up of just the cockpit. Yeah. And, you get a few shots of planes in the distance kind of doing their turns into dives and stuff like that. But it's always from the perspective of Bale's cockpit.
Yeah.
You never get these sweeping, grand action shots of the planes coming down.
It's very intimate. It's very intimate. I think that's a great example of, and now obviously to a lot of people listening here, and to myself and to you too, Colin, $10 million when we're saying, oh, what a tiny budget. $10 million is, of course, more money than most people ever have to make a film.
Yes.
But this extrapolates, right? This extrapolates to much smaller budget. This is a great example of where budgetary constraints can actually help a film.
Yeah.
And can actually help you find more interesting solutions for, storytelling challenges. And
I mean, because it's kind of a contradiction, but films get more expensive the bigger budget they get. If that makes any sense.
Oh, no,
So
absolutely.
with $500,000, you would arguably make, not just in the literal sense of you're only spending $500,000, but you would make technically a cheaper film versus $10 million because you have the $10 million and now it becomes a larger production. You're spending more money in every aspect.
It's like it's like there's like this reverse economy of scale or something.
Exactly.
Right. It's like the more people you have, the more, yes, costs just balloon. And I think it's another great, I think it's for independent filmmakers, for filmmakers just starting out, I guess maybe just filmmakers in general. I mean, Herzog does provide a really great example throughout his career of doing a lot with not a lot of money. And more importantly, maybe even not waiting for this perfect, I've got to have $50 million to make this movie. I mean, Herzog could have said, there's no way I'm making this film for less than $60 million. And he'd still be waiting to make it. But the fact that he's so willing to, to compromise on budgets and to really put himself out there, he's got a crew of diehard people he's worked a long time with, and he's willing to go out there and sleep in a little hut without trailers, and he keeps things so cheap, and a big part of that is just he's willing to go through he's willing to suffer, but and I think for him though, and he's turned it into something that's not even really suffering, which is fantastic. It's adventure. It's adventure.
Prolific. Yeah, exactly.
Which is kind of, I feel like, what Dieter saw this as, which is just mind blowing. And one of the things too that I thought was really interesting was that in the postscript for this, apparently Dieter went on to be a pilot and had several more plane crashes.
Four more crashes as a test pilot.
Survived. And that's just one more way that I can kind of see Dieter and Herzog being similar. It's like Herzog goes out into the jungle and he's like, everything's trying to murder you. But it's like he goes back out there 6 more times. And I get a strong sense that Dieter is just the exact same way. A lot of people would have been like, no way, man. That's my last day flying ever when I got shot down and had to spend half a year in a POW camp.
Yeah.
I'm not doing that again.
And I remember when the Herzog Masterclass was first announced and the trailer came out and stuff, and there was one line in it that always kind of stuck with me, which is that like Herzog is a director who's even whose flops are magnificent, and flops, of course, meaning like the budget or the box office flops.
Right.
And it's like even when his movies don't,
return a lot of money.
Return their money or whatever, they're still such interesting movies and such special movies. And I think that very much is kind of in line with what you're saying, which is that like even if you crash that plane 4 more times, you're still a pilot. Like he's still going at it. He's still in that career, in that line of work, which is really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Persistence is a key aspect to both Dieter's personality and to Herzog's personality. Some interesting things too, especially we haven't done a lot of comparison to the documentary. So I'd like we could touch base on that a little bit since we just did that last week. It's fresh in our minds. But the kind of this idea of, and there's a handful of interesting things here to discuss. I think this idea, and it's a thread throughout all of Herzog's work, is kind of this difference between an accountant's truth and an ecstatic truth, and this quote unquote real life versus the narrative that he's presenting in this film, I think is really interesting. Some of these things are pretty kind of straightforward and simple. I mean, look, films are always, you're streamlining stories. You've only got an hour and a half, 2 hours to tell a story. So you're always simplifying and streamlining. And of course, some of that happens here. I mean, there's details that are discussed in Little Dieter Needs to Fly that are left out here. And in quote unquote real life, Dieter is captured, he escapes, and then he's captured again. And then he's walked to a prison camp, and I think it's somewhat like 6 weeks or something.
Yeah, he describes 6 weeks of just walking through the jungle and torture in the jungle and stuff like that before he arrives at the camp.
Before he even arrives at the camp. Yeah. And so we see, very much a streamlining of that story here.
Yeah, it's only 3 days or so. Yeah.
We just leave out all that too. He crash lands, and he's caught almost immediately. Yeah. And it only takes a couple days to walk. And
I would say also the only real specific point of like tail from Dieter's description of that 6 weeks is the offer to kind of be not released but have better treatment if he were to disavow the American action. And he, we see that where he sat down in a house. I'm not sure how it occurred in real life. He never really goes into details of if he was in that house or if it was just out in some village or something. But yeah, he goes into a rather, a more built up civilized house rather than like a hut in the forest. And it's very clearly some sort of place that
military
the
outpost
exactly. And is offered, to disavow and sign a paper that disavows U.S. military action in Vietnam.
Right.
And as in real life, of course, he refuses. So that part is in there, which of course is an important kind of character-defining moment for him. But you also described that there's a point that's deleted, which is, as we discussed last week, this idea of his ring being stolen by a villager.
Right.
And so they shot that scene. You said, I haven't seen the deleted scene, but you watched it on the Blu-ray.
Well, they did actually,
Or they shot it. And talk a little bit about that.
Well, so let's remember, we'll go back to the documentary and remember Dieter tells a story about how he was being, after he was caught a second time and he's being walked to the POW camp, they stop off in a village and one of the villagers steals his ring. And I can't remember, it's a wedding ring, I think it is, right? Or something. And
his engagement ring. He got engaged, I think, the day before he
went on so he had a ring as part of his engagement. Which I never had. I'll have to tell I didn't get an engagement ring, but my wife did. I didn't. But it's stolen by a villager, and I guess this is just kind of one of these weird. It's like you can hardly make this up because you wouldn't think this would happen in real life, right? So it's almost like more difficult to put this into a film than it is, because it hardly makes sense. But he actually went to his captors and said, "Hey, they stole my engagement ring." And they literally, like the people who were torturing him went to the villager on his behalf and cut off the villager's finger to give him back his ring. And of course, this is, this clearly shows that the captors are not just these monsters. I mean, that, they have...
It more shows that they're doing a job, if anything.
Morals and values, absolutely. And they're like, hey, that even though this guy's a POW and he's from somebody, he's somebody from a country that's been killing our people and we're in war... that's still inappropriate, and they. And
it also kind of it almost, to me, what I would have liked to see about that scene. I understand why Herzog says he cut it due to the violence, but what I like about graphic. That is, to me, that almost shows. And there's other instances in the movie of this being shown, so I can see why it wasn't totally necessary. But it shows to me this funny contradiction of like rules of war or like war crimes, which is like you can shoot someone, but you can't shoot someone the wrong way. You can kill people, you can't kill people in the wrong way. And it, to me, is exactly this, which is we're going to torture you, but we're not going to mistreat you. You're still a human being, so we're going to torture you even though you're a prisoner of war. But how dare we're not
dare
rude
someone
to you.
steal your right? It's
and
like
so it's
theft.
like this great. I mean, to me, that is just a great moment of contradiction.
Just the term war crimes in and of themselves is kind of
it's hilarious.
This kind of paradox, right, of just ridiculousness, but or iron, this just irony of how that all works out. But so and you're correct that Herzog did shoot this, and he said he was pushed by the production to shoot it, and I think because it's this is quite cinematic, it's actiony, it's kind of it's spectacular, if you will, it's spectacle. But Herzog said that he just he felt like that this violence against such an innocent person just really bothered him, and so he decided to leave it out. But they did shoot it, and it was pretty graphic. I mean, we're like right there on the hand, But they did.
I'll have to check it out afterwards and take a look at it.
Well, apparently his first cut of the film was about 2 hours 40 minutes. I think he said.
Yeah, 240.
240. And so what is the final film at? I think it's just a hair.
Just over 2 hours. Like an hour and 2 minutes, or 2 hours and 2 minutes. I think. Sorry.
Exactly. So he clearly cut out quite a bit. But I can absolutely see why too. To have to be captured and escape and then be captured again, and then I think he really worked hard to get us in the POW camp quickly, introduce us to the rest of the characters, and he does that. I think we get there pretty quickly, within 10 minutes or something. So that's quite a bit of simplification from Dieter's story.
Yeah.
But this is interesting to me. And, that's something where it's like, okay, this is. I feel like that's pretty clear cut. Films always do this, and it doesn't seem controversial.
It's just
or
about
strange to me
efficiency
at
of
all.
storytelling. Yeah.
Efficiency of storytelling doesn't bother me at all. But this, I think, is more complicated and is more interesting of a topic to me. Yep, you know what I'm going to say. So apparently, Herzog, when he was writing the film, when he was writing the script, he sat down with Dieter over some beers and basically just listened to Dieter tell stories and wrote down all of his stories and then kind of fit together what he wanted to highlight in the film. And apparently, when the film was released, there was a little bit of controversy where the family of some of the other real life people who were in this situation, like Eugene de Bruin, for example, who was portrayed by Jeremy Davies, that there was
one of the men who actually survived, which is his name was, I've got it right here, Pashidhi Indradat, who I think he says the other survivor of the group. So there were 2 survivors total, and I think he was one of the Thai men that got away.
Okay, so there was, I think, a little bit of controversy. You'll have to tell me a little bit more about him or his family. But for Eugene de Bruin, I think they felt like his depiction in the film was pretty one-sided, that it wasn't actually factually accurate. But the question that this raises for me that I think is an interesting one and especially right when you're dealing with telling a supposed, a true story, if you will, or telling a story based on facts, based on actual real people. And especially if you're going to use those people's names, right? I mean, theoretically, Herzog could have made this film and he could have changed the name. I mean, it could be based on Dieter's life, but he could have changed the name so that, he could have done several different things to kind of tackle this. But, he used everybody's real names. It's clearly this is, about a real event. I'm curious what your thoughts are on what obligations, if any, do you feel like Herzog had to seek more sources than just Dieter's, or, to go to these others' families, to proactively seek them out and get their perspective, or I guess for lack of a better word, to do like well-rounded research.
Yeah.
What do you feel like?
It's difficult to say because I can't really, like, in terms of the ethics, it's difficult to say without knowing the exact situation of, they say that they tried to reach out to Herzog during production.
Oh, I'm not even asking to sit in judgment of Herzog in this case. I guess I'm kind of I'm kind of curious myself too about just let's take this away from just this one specific case.
Yeah.
But just in general.
So I can see why it's done. I can see, and not only specifically to this, but generally I can see, in any instance of a movie, my first instinct is like, how do we raise the stakes, right? And so this is clearly a way to raise the stakes is, okay, one of the people that they're in camp with is, has this fundamental, obsession with the fact that they're going to be set free. So that automatically creates a conflict, which rises the drama. So I can see from a narrative storytelling standpoint why you would do that, why we would decide to go in that direction.
Sure.
So I don't, it's one of those things that it's difficult because there's kind of, again, there's 2 sides of that too. There's the other side of it though, where it's like, how inaccurate is okay to be claiming truth, right? Because the other man that I mentioned that actually did escape, one of the Thai prisoners who got away and survived, he describes that that they had this whole escape plan prior to Dieter being there, and that they waited 2 weeks to tell him, and that they were all in on it, and that Gene, who is kind of portrayed as the guy that is like, I'll scream if you guys try to escape because they'll kill us all if we do, and very fearful and stuff like that, that he shared food in real life, that he went back for other prisoners who were sick. Yeah, it was
actually quite heroic.
So there's all this other stuff, and Herzog acknowledges that after the movie. He says, I wasn't aware, and stuff like that, which is good. But again, I mean, I think it's not our place to, at least to me, I'm not going to judge a filmmaker's actions on how they just decided to tell their story. I can understand being disappointed as a family and being angered at that, because it's like, this is our family member's legacy.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think that Herzog, just Herzog's mindset to me was, how do I make this story more engaging and more interesting and more exciting?
Right.
I mean, that was his angle. I don't think his intention was by any means to, take memory of someone and tarnish them and make them a bad person.
Yeah.
And I also think at the same time too, I think it's also a completely reasonable reaction and response to be in a prisoner of war camp and to be fearful for your life and to say, if we try to escape, they're going to kill us all. Like when I was watching the movie, I don't see that character by any means as an antagonist. I see that character as someone who's just been in a prisoner of war camp for years and is so desperate at this point that his mind is basically gone to the point of just like, how do I survive?
Right.
And I thought that was, if anything, again, when we're talking about this efficiency of storytelling, that is to me like this almost this warning sign to Dieter of like, this is what's going to happen to me if I'm here for too long, and that then drives him to want to escape faster when it's and wants him to leave. So to me it's again, in terms of the ethical standing of it, I'm not going to really put my judgment in because I think that I would need to be more involved in the context to really make a fair judgment on that.
Sure.
And so I can understand both sides. I can definitely understand where both sides are coming from on it.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, I agree. I'm not going to sit here in judgment of Herzog as a person at all, not even close. But it's an interesting question, that different shades of this question, I think, are likely to kind of come in front of us. If you make a certain number of films, if you're in this gig for very long, I think you'll likely kind of run across some kind of coloration of this question, right? Mm-hmm. How you present things, especially anytime if you're working with a documentary and there are actually real live people involved. These aren't made up characters, but we're actually dealing with real people. Yeah. There's this question I think comes up a lot. And it's certainly, I mean, I know that it's come up for me, how you represent people. And, how do you choose to handle that? How do you balance the, shaping the story versus how you deal with the actual human beings who represent the people on the screen when you're done? And I don't think there are easy answers. I think every filmmaker has to, I mean, hopefully you're at least thinking about these things, though. And that's a good start. Hopefully...
Yeah, who knows if, because again, the families say that they tried to reach out to Herzog during the production and that they, to no avail. And that, again, could completely just be like Herzog's publicist just being like, no, I'm not going to let him know. He's busy.
Yeah.
I don't see Herzog as someone who would have intentionally maligned somebody.
No, I don't think so at all.
And of course, again, that's all speculation, but
doesn't seem likely.
It doesn't seem likely
that
just given the past of his... his actions in the past, it doesn't seem like he... And I'll take him at his word to say that if he says, had I known this, I would have altered that and made it more accurate to life. I believe him on that. But
absolutely. Again,
it's one of those things, too, that comes out just like... At any point, people are going to criticize inaccuracies in film, but there almost always has to be some level of inaccuracy because you you just simply can't tell... an 100% true story through film, whether it's documentary or whether it's a narrative.
And people are always going to have different. It's like ultimately too, it would come down. Let's just take this case for example. Yeah. It's like, okay, you've got one survivor. You've got Dieter telling his story. You may have other family members saying, well, that's not what we heard, so it almost becomes like a he said, she said, or kind of, these different perspectives. And it's like, that could be an impossible quagmire to wade through, and you may not end up ever even being able to, start shooting.
And the other difficulty,
you can't get through that.
The other difficulty there too is just that it's like, again, we weren't there for those conversations with Dieter and Herzog. So do I think that Dieter seems like someone who would, have told Herzog that one of us was cowardly? No, I think that, like, to me, if I'm allowed to speculate for a moment, what I think would have happened was just that those details about the specifics between the interpersonal things were, again, stripped down to their basics for efficiency's sake, because they did also cut out one person. There were 7 prisoners of war in real life, and there's only 6 in the movie. So I'm sure that Herzog was just kind of like, oh, right, let's just put, certain characters have certain plot functions, and we need to fulfill those. So we're just going to, for the sake of efficiency, put those into the different people and alter their personalities slightly. Yeah. And so I think it was more just a matter to me, again, of like, while Herzog was writing the script, he was like, well, we need something to prevent Dieter from going out immediately. We need to prevent Dieter from his full on, like, there needs to be conflict within this prisoner of war camp. It can't just be entirely
Right.
okay, we're going to break out. It's not the Great Escape. There has to be some conflict. So that's what I see.
And I think it comes back to, again, what the intention kind of isn't to like pick apart this particular instance, but rather I feel like it kind of, it is an instance of a question that just comes up a lot as any artist. And I think, Herzog speaks to it a lot too. I think it's something that Herzog has handled, dealt with, and spoke to throughout his entire career. And, he frames the question of an accountant's truth versus an ecstatic truth. And so I see that in his work for sure, and it's extremely clear in his documentaries, more apparent than most other filmmakers. Yeah. His desire to eschew that accountant's facts and move toward it, what he sees as an aesthetic truth. I think it just so happens in this film you're using real people's names
and sensitive subject matter,
and it's a very sensitive subject matter. So I certainly can see that, but I agree with you completely. I don't think there was ever any kind of intention to misrepresent somebody or to make somebody appear in a bad light. I don't think so at all. So yeah. But and I agree with you too. I think that overall, it's like I didn't look at any of these characters and think, oh my gosh, what a horrible person. I think like, wow, this is the range of potential human responses to the most extreme situation I could ever imagine. I mean,
because of course Dwayne, while not being the someone who says I'm gonna prevent our escape, Dwayne is also very much a someone who in the movie is seen as, for lack of a better term, weak. Is seen as as they're making their way through the jungle, he says leave me behind. He doesn't assist with the escape when he was supposed to and things like that. And so that's a big point of difference, whereas in real life supposedly there was very much more group effort in terms of the assistance of the escape, whereas in the movie it's kind of more represented as Dieter being sort of abandoned and having to do it all himself, including by Dwayne. Dwayne not intentionally, but rather he throws up on the ground and is kind of sick, so Dieter goes on and succeeds without him. But again, so like you said, it was the range of human reaction, range of human response to these situations that I found interesting rather than necessarily indicting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, it's just important to remember as well. I mean, I think, this is, and Herzog says in the commentary track at the end of this film, which is a really beautiful and I think more sentimental kind of Hollywood-ish ending than almost any other of Herzog's films. But Herzog said, he's talking about this ending and how he said he really wanted this to be a gift to Dieter's sons, because Dieter was passed away at this point. But that I really got a sense that Herzog's goal here was to tell Dieter's story as Dieter shared it and felt it. Shared it with Herzog and as he felt it personally. So all of us have our own, truths that we see the world through. I mean, none of our memories are any kind of objective reality truth. And so I think that, this is very much a film that's told very much from one person's perspective, and that's okay. And, sometimes I can, again, like you said, I can understand how if you were, a family member of yours was represented in a way that you didn't feel like was truthful, that might be painful. But, I think all told, Herzog generally does a really good job of, and he's like, well, tell anybody, anywhere, hey, I'm not saying that everything that happened in this story is factually true. I'm working toward an artistic truth. And it's something that I try to work towards as well, and I think it's a good goal. So
totally, yeah.
All right, well, we've knocked another one down, Colin. Yeah, I can't believe it. 27 episodes in, that's outstanding. I look forward to seeing what film we're going to cover next time. But as always, I enjoyed our conversation, and I look forward to next time. So until then, everybody, thanks so much for hanging out with us. We'll catch you on the flip side.
Bye.